Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first of our end of the year ranking videos on this new channel where we will be covering the worst of Monstercat in 2025. After a crazy 2024, my main question heading into this year was, what exactly did Monstercat want to be? I don't know if that question has been answered for me. With each year I've reviewed so far, there's been a common trend. In 2023, it was the House influx on Instinct. In 2024, it was the Brittum influx on Uncaged. This year, it was really a mix of multiple influxes with varying degrees of success. Even then, there was still a fair share of lows, some of which were sporadic, others more consolidated towards months that were expected to be good and trends that were expected to be bad. The best way to describe this list is that it feels like a mix of the previous two. I don't think it's as bad as last year, maybe apart from the top 2 or 3. And with the rest of this list, you could probably mix up the order and I'd still find a way to agree with you. For those who haven't seen my ranking videos before, every list proper will have one track per artist to make things fair, and it will be originals only. And now that I've got more space for ranking videos like these, if you haven't noticed by now, the best and worst lists will now be separate videos, which means an extended list of dishonorable mentions. Push It Way Down Low by Mersive. It hasn't been a good year for dubstep on this label. A lot of it either stuck with the Brittum trend of last year or went for a newer freeform bass or throwback trend, which often hasn't been executed well. This is one of those tracks that just goes nowhere for me. To the Floor by Dioro, Riot 10, and J. Cruz. A track that I fully expected would make the list proper when I first heard it. The Square 4 production from Riot 10 is sloppy, and yet it's not even the worst part. The last drop from Dioro was absolutely pathetic as well. It only misses the list proper because of something worse down the line. Chaos Will Bring Peace by Sullivan King. A last-minute cut from this top 10. The tear-out sounds were just a very rough listen, and while I do respect his attempt at raw style, the structure around it is just all wrong for the second drop. Light Show by Thirst. I had a feeling they'd fall back this year. An attempt at something more mid-tempo related, but the vocals are insanely repetitive, and it's another track that kind of feels mostly stagnant overall. Loving Me by YDG and Bella Renee. The first of multiple freeform-based songs that had little to offer from the start. Where on this occasion, the empty and unintriguing drops just overshadow everything else. The High We Seek by Coven. The Moments in Everglow album was the moment where I got tired of the whole drum and bass push at the time. For multiple tracks from that album, the progression just felt a bit slow-paced, and here the lead melody clashes more than it really fits in. Throwin' Bows by Diesel and Perry Wayne. In comparison to Guerrilla Warfare, MDE leaned more towards the Brittum side of dubstep on occasion, but this song references one of the worst parts of Guerrilla Warfare, where the overbearing sustain makes for a very rough listen. Bout Your Love by Rusko. Yeah, there were multiple EPs that I either didn't like or didn't care for this year. The vocals are pretty annoying here, the production is messy as well, and you know, One Man Army was close to representing this spot, but I felt this was slightly worse. Close to Me by Olivers. I wish I liked Olivers more on this label, and he was close to making my dishonorable mentions last year too. Again, I don't like how the vocals are used in the drop, and the growls in the production don't work well for me either. Palm of Your Hand by Borgor, Level Up, and Eloise Keeble. I can imagine this is going to be a bit easier of a target. I wouldn't call it straight up Brittum, it kind of mixes in with the throwback side of dubstep on occasion, but it's still a clumsy production that only gets worse as it progresses. Never Enough by KVSH and Dynamic. A tech house song that simply didn't have much to offer. The bass line is uninteresting, the growls and vocal chops don't provide much either, and while the chimes in the second part are solid, it was never going to be enough. Go by John Casey and Peekaboo. Awful vocals here, and the drop is centered around them too. And that's before we even get into the controversy with the lyricism. Feels like the Brazilian funk trend all over again. I am dreading reviewing the NCS label this year. Erased by Whipped Cream and Andrea Botes. It's been another bad year for Whipped Cream, mostly relying on the house and techno scene nowadays, and here it's just too repetitive, especially in the vocal. Only Be Myself by Beast Boy and Aria. So by now you're probably seeing multiple themes within these songs. They're either repetitive, centered around nothing, centered around bad or annoying vocals, or centered around trends that just don't really work for me. This is a case of the latter, where the triplet warbles are pretty annoying to listen to, and the scarce vocal chops only make it worse. And finally, Like That by Cascade and Win Win. I didn't really like any of the original albums Monstercat had this year. With Undux, a lot of it leaned more towards a calmer commercial side of house, with the end consisting of more experimental stuff that really didn't work out. This one in particular made absolutely no sense for me. An inconsistent, occasionally empty clash in production that only got more unnerving for me as it progressed. And with all of that out of the way, let's talk about the top 10 worst Monstercat songs of 2025. Number 10. On today's episode of Random Comparisons Nobody Asked For, let's take a trip back to NCS in 2024 and talk about a song that has gotten some quiet acclaim but has mostly been swept under the radar since. Models by Hush. A freeform bass release that was pretty hard to come by at the time, where the vocals were very annoying, but it had some stuff to offer elsewhere in its production. And despite sporadic acclaim, I had a feeling it wouldn't represent a trend on NCS, or if it did, it wouldn't remain as well received. And here's why. At this point, it feels like whatever Odd Kid Out is doing on the label isn't working. We all remember the Cinema VIP back in 2022, and really the only passable songs he has made since then were Not the One and the Eliminate collab. For most of his other stuff, it's not just squandered potential, it's wasted in the most unnecessarily unique of ways. It's like expecting a PS5 for your birthday only to get a random Animal Crossing plushie. A comparison that doesn't make a lot of sense, and neither does this song. With the pacing of it, it sounds at first like he might be switching up to something house related, but once the drop hits, it finds a new way to collapse in all of its momentum. The production is mostly empty outside of the low end, and the percussion only adds on to its weakness. The worst part about it is how lethargic it is. At least most other freeform bass songs were quicker and, well, expected from the start to be dubstep-oriented in the first place. Here, it's yet another unnecessary switch-up for another wasted opportunity. Feeling wonky indeed. Number 9. With more prestige, there should be more pressure. There are some house artists, especially in the mainstream, that don't tend to put a lot of effort in their releases nowadays. Maybe the spark that was once there isn't as bright as it used to be. When you watch a lot of live sets of certain artists over the years, it can be easy to tell. And as someone who has seen a couple of his sets from years prior, I think Valentino Khan should know a lot better than to debut like this. I'm sick of tech house songs that feel like they just do the bare minimum, especially when they come from bigger artists that have made much more exciting work before. Yeah, Deep Down Low and Pump can technically be put in a similar category of tech house, but even those songs can carry more detail and deserved acclaim compared to this. It's one of those tracks that, ironically, feels like it's going nowhere. The production falls very flat, and the main structure from the bass line to the vocals is based off of 2 notes, and that's it. And speaking of the vocals, Meryl's droning, along with nonsensical lyricism throughout, only makes it more unappealing. As with most tech house, this is one of the more absence of good type of songs, where, apart from the end, there's next to nothing I could really give credit to. I'm guessing this elevator is only going one direction. Number 8. In terms of the Uncaged label, it's meant to be reliant on the heavier side of EDM, and it's clear that dubstep and drum and bass are some of their biggest priorities. I have generally been more of a house and hardstyle type of guy, and it's understandable that hard dance isn't that much of a go-to genre for this label. Even then, it still deserved a better representation than what it got. Glad Pally might be one of the weirdest arrivals to the label. To think someone on a charity stream with Dual Damage a month prior would not only debut, but start off this year. I tried to hear him out with some live sets, and even there he seemed to lean more towards a meme drum and bass production that was probably just about as annoying. Now the trend over the past couple of years was that the first song would be centered around hard dance, and in years prior, it was with Nanobi, and it only puts more pressure coming from someone who's paid a lot more attention to the hardstyle scene, and there's not much worth taking away here. First off, 96 seconds is way too short. Secondly, the concept of the pitched kicks trying to showcase the main melody really doesn't work. And the rest of the drop production feels simple and unpolished for the most part. The screech in the heavy side of the drop is abrasive, and the melodic drop doesn't have much going for it either. It was a debut that had high expectations from the start given the circumstances, and just didn't live up to them whatsoever. Number 7. I had a feeling this was going to happen. I said in my mid-year video that an NCS push would be better for this guy, and this is only proving my point. At least New Worlds and really most of his stuff in 2024 on Monstercat had him think outside the box with his dubstep production, but this one sees him camouflage back into the Brittum trend. There's really not too much I can say in detail about it when the detail isn't there and it doesn't tell me anything new. The vocals are fine, although the structure heading into the build-up is a little off. But as for the drop production, it doesn't have anything going in its favor. It's largely rigid at first with the wallop of the growls before utilizing a different rhythm in the second part that's just less cohesive. That's about the summary of his lowlights in production as a whole, except this time it's flat-footed mostly in sound selection rather than pacing or concept. And I can tell because another song of his utilized sound selection a lot better, and well, that might be a conversation for another video. Number 6. Remember when I said this list would feel like a mix of the previous two? Well, part of the reference to 2023 is due to the artists within. Wales and Sullivan King were both artists that got on my nerves in 2023, with similar stories heading into their releases here, potential in releases elsewhere that simply couldn't carry over. And much like them, this is an act that had some momentum at the start of the year and just ran out of gas. Or should I say, ran out of diesel. It was difficult to decide his worst song. It really could have been any one of the releases he had in July, but revisiting this song, it best represented the fall after the Pride, for lack of a better term. It opens with Diesel being less of a rapper and more of a hype man for the most part. In the Tear Out drop, the high-pitched drill is awful, and it overshadows the rest of the production. The low end from the techno drop doesn't do anything more against it, but doesn't do anything to save it either. Felt like he just slapped one on there and called it a day. I would argue more space between the two drops would make for a better structure than what it had, given that it started with about a minute of Diesel on the mic in a 2.5-minute song. And much like Chaos Will Bring Peace, it hurts because I thought Diesel wouldn't fall into the same traps. Guess that side of things really does feel like 2023 all over again. Number 5. I think it's safe to say that tech house is probably the worst subgenre of house music. My two main problems with it are that it often lacks any sort of energy, and it often relies on a repetitive template. Take, for example, Yeah, I get that the push for tech house was much more isolated than back in 2023. Maybe that's part of why they stuck out like a sore thumb this year. A debut from Bior, and it's probably the most wasteful release Instinct has had in quite some time. I've put this higher than Elevator because it somehow feels even more needless. From the whispery, mostly indifferent vocals to the insanely repetitive art surrounding the drop that... Hang on a minute, are they playing the same exact 2 notes that Elevator had? Well, you could argue it's 3, but that's beside the point. The vocal chops in the second part of the drop also don't work at all. And then in the following break, you have a reference to Callus's milkshake through the vocals, and really, who even wants that? From top to bottom, this is one of the biggest examples of everything wrong with the tech house scene. Finding that balance between boring and annoying and having next to no redeemable elements within. How is it that we had 2 songs named Crashout, and Riot 10 had the better one? Number 4. Despite the Brittum trend being much more obvious last year, it was still fairly prevalent this year too. I can already see some comments calling this a contentious pick, but let's not mince words here. Both of these artists made my list last year, and all I can say here is, welcome back, gentlemen. Watch the clock. This was a track I knew from the start would make my list proper. I was never a fan of either of these artists, and it doesn't seem like that's going to change with them together. And it's not even the drops either this time. The break tries to go for a cinematic feel, overshadowed by vocals repeating the title, and then repeating fractions of the title further for absolutely no reason. Then you have the pre-drop section with the growling sustain, which makes the drop lack the necessary punch when it first hits. And speaking of the drop, I get the argument they're at least trying to use different styles in their sound selection. My counter-argument to that? None of it works. It feels like miss after miss, especially with the higher-pitched ones that sound like they have a higher attack, which leads to even less of a punch. And the ending part of the drops is noticeably awful as well. It's yet another part of the influx that has gotten on my nerves early and often. Number 3. And speaking of Brittum artists who have been struggling to find a good run of form as of recently... A little surprised this wound up so high, but at the same time, it felt like it was about time. I had my doubts about Company since Tax Evasion last year, and it's only gotten worse on the label since then. Mostly accelerated by his Nemesis EP, which had a couple of off-label transfers, one of which a highly anticipated song featuring the Let's Go Gambling meme. That's about all it had going for it. This was one of those songs that only got worse upon each revisit, where the atmosphere in the break is trying to go for a dark and spacey tone, doesn't do too well at that. And as for the rest of the production, speaking of Samplifier, I can take what I said about his Goom last year and apply it here. The sound selection simply doesn't work. It's pretty abrasive under a fairly common Brittum template for the most part, with the second drop taking more of an offbeat stance on occasion. A lot of this scene, at least on this label, seems to rely on some of these templates. On one hand, it can make sense for live set energy, but on the other hand, not only does it often fall flat on its face, but those templates can make for a less distinctive identity with everything sounding so similar. Maybe that's what Company failed to bring this year. Number 2. The Feral EP was the moment where I finally understood the vitriol with Riot 10, to the point where he wound up top of my list last year. And as this year progressed, it wasn't just a case of how high on the list he would be, but also what song would represent the spot. Now I'd like to give a massive shout out to Kaltzy, or EDM Cow Cow. The past couple of years, I participated in that channel's worst or most disappointing EDM songs of the year, and last year there were a couple of rhythm songs I submitted that seemed to spark some debate. I remember having a conversation with an underground dubstep producer, Nihilist, and my response to her I think best explains my stance with the rhythm scene as a whole. Sure, the Square 4 style of Brittum is often a bland style of bad, but there are times when it can hit hard if it's given the right sound selection and it doesn't do anything stupid. When a Brittum track lacks any sort of cohesion and can't even keep a beat, that's when it's near unlistenable for me. It's one thing when Riot 10 sticks around, it's another when he feels like a mainstay and is able to push an album here as quickly as he did. With a lot of his stuff here, even his stronger suits with the album felt relatively clumsier in comparison to other artists, and his floor represented some of the biggest recent lows of this label as a whole. Oddly, this album felt more like Canal Street Crook than Feral, mainly because it got most of its absolute worst stuff out of the way quickly. It was only between two songs for me. To the Floor, for the longest time, was the main contender from first listen, with the template production being sloppy and Dior's involvement only making it worse. But this song showcases what I dislike most about the Brittum scene. The offbeat stutter is jarring for the first drop, where it's not just hastily mixed, but downright bad in concept. The triplet drop is just as bad, if not worse, alternating that sound selection with abrasive and repetitive robotic growls. And it gets on my nerves when really any Brittum production is unnecessarily offbeat, but this one's special in that it has absolutely nothing going in its favor. And thus the Requiem culminates not with a bang, but with whatever this is. Number 1. I'm just relieved that Riot 10 isn't my number 1 again. For once, we can, I guess, celebrate some parity with these lists, especially since I didn't expect it to happen a few weeks after the album was released. I didn't think it would happen from a newcomer, and I didn't think it would be part of a trap influx that was otherwise fairly decent. But yeah, couldn't stand this song from the very first listen. Let's travel back to the start of the decade. Before the return of Skrillex and the rise of Isonoc, trap music was arguably in its driest spell yet, where most of it felt like it was hollow or leaning on the likes of trap rap. And even the labels centered around the genre just couldn't find or offer much therein. That was the embodiment of Happy to Be Here in a nutshell, with most of it being either bland or downright annoying to listen to. Ironically, just like the Feral EP last year, I thought his debut was bad enough to make the list at the time, but wow, this was something else. Mostly leaning to a trap rap style that may have a scheme within the concept, but could not have executed it any worse if it tried. To put it simply, this is one of the worst trap drops I have heard in recent memory. The blaring siren is unlistenable. There is no cohesion with everything else, and the constant descending of it makes it even more egregious to listen to. And for a track called Earthquake, it should not be relying on such minimalist percussion. And the rapping from Paid in Full doesn't add anything remotely new, interesting, or likable to this whole concept either. I can imagine a lot of you were expecting a Brittum song to top this list, but while trap music may be high on a hill right now, this song represents the worst of its preceding valley. And that is why Earthquake by John Casey and Paid in Full is the worst Monstercat song of 2025. And that will wrap up this video. Let me know of your least favorites in the comments below. I'm not sure how long my other lists will take, so stay tuned for that. And if you guys enjoyed, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And I'll talk to you in the next video.